Hi guys, I hope you're all doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome back to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies old and new. Also, welcome to a brand new episode of Truly Horror, the series where we talk about the true stories, true events, true inspirations and true crimes surrounding certain horror movies. The behind the scenes stuff that is often stranger and scarier than the movies themselves. As you may be able to guess from my little pal sitting behind me here, today we're talking about the true inspirations behind Child's Play and its antagonist Chucky the Doll. This episode will be different to my previous Conjuring ones as there are fewer categories to break it down into, so instead I'll talk about the movie itself, both creative information and then the movie's story, and then we'll get into the real life inspirations behind the movie's story. The original Child's Play was written and created by Don Mancini and created by Tom Holland. Mancini's involvement with the movie eventually ended up being minimal and not actually going past writing the initial story and pre-production stages. Due to the 1988 Writers Guild of America strike, he was unable to be involved further and was never actually on the set of the movie. So instead, Tom Holland, the director, David Kirshner, the producer, and writer John Lafayette made any of the alterations to the script that were needed. It was made on a budget of $9 million and ended up making $44.2 million at the box office and was eventually released in November 1988. The movie opens with serial killer Charles Lee Ray being chased through the streets of Chicago by Detective Mike Norris. Charles is shot by Detective Norris and his getaway driver Eddie panics and drives off, leaving Charles behind. Trying to evade the detective, Charles breaks into a toy store, but he's pursued by Norris and is shot for a second time. Realizing he's dying, Charles swears revenge on Detective Norris and his getaway driver Eddie. He then begins muttering about having to find somebody, and he stumbles into a display of talking good guy dolls, knocking them over onto the floor. Charles grabs one of the dolls out of the box and begins performing a voodoo chant that transfers a soul from one body to another. The voodoo chant causes a lightning storm to gather and the toy store is struck by lightning, causing it to explode, and Detective Norris finds the dead body of Charles Lee Ray amongst the rubble. But what he doesn't know is that Lee Ray successfully transferred his soul into one of the good guy dolls. We're then introduced to Karen Barkley and her 6-year-old son Andy. It's Andy's birthday and what he wants most in the world is one of the brand new good guy dolls that's advertised on TV, and is disappointed when he doesn't end up getting one. But later at work, Karen's friend Maggie tells her there's a guy selling a good guy doll outside where they work, and so Karen does manage to surprise Andy later that day with his dream present. The good guy doll introduces himself to Andy as Chucky, and once Chucky is in the Barkley house, strange and tragic things begin to happen. It starts out small with Chucky whispering to Andy and the TV turning itself on with Chucky moving from one room to another room, but very quickly things begin to escalate when Chucky kills Karen's friend Maggie while she's babysitting Andy. But Chucky is about the size of Andy, and as no one's going to believe a doll killed her, the eye of suspicion falls on Andy. The next day, Chucky persuades Andy to skip school and take the train downtown so that Chucky can pay his getaway driver Eddie a visit. Chucky kills Eddie by causing a gas explosion, and Andy and Chucky are picked up by the police at some point after the accident. The police don't believe Andy's claims that Chucky is alive and is actually the Lakeshore Strangler Charles Lee Ray, and being concerned about his well-being, Andy is admitted to a psychiatric hospital for a few days. In the meantime, Andy's mum Karen has discovered that Andy was telling the truth and that Chucky really is alive, but when she's unable to convince Detective Norris, who is leading the investigations into both Maggie and Eddie's deaths, Karen sets out to find answers on her own. But believing she may be in danger, Detective Norris follows Karen, and together they find out what we, the audience, already knew, that Chucky the Doll is in fact Charles Lee Ray. Although it takes Norris being physically attacked by Chucky before he's willing to fully believe it. What we discover is that Charles Lee Ray studied voodoo under a man named John Bishop, in particular the teachings of how to cheat death. But Charles, according to John, perverts these teachings in order to both commit murders and transfer his soul into the good guy doll. When Chucky is injured while in the doll body, he decides to pay John a visit, who explains that the longer his soul remains in the doll, the more human he will become. And through using a voodoo doll of John, Chucky is able to find out that he can escape the doll body by transferring his soul into the body of the first human he revealed his true identity to. Which, bad news for Andy, it's him. Chucky then heads to the psychiatric hospital where Andy is being held, but Andy, that smart little 6-year-old, manages to escape because, he's a capable 6-year-old. He heads home, but he is followed very closely by Chucky. But luckily, before Chucky is able to complete the voodoo chant that will transfer his soul into Andy's body, he is stopped by Karen, Andy's mum, and Detective Norris. And Child's Play ends with the destruction of the doll body and the apparent death of Charles Lee Ray. Of course, being a horror fan and being aware that Child's Play turned into a long and successful running franchise, we know that it wasn't the end of Charles Lee Ray or Chucky. Through the power of voodoo and the help of his fabulous partner in crime, Tiffany, Chucky goes on to get up to all sorts of antics. But what was, if there was one, the real inspiration behind the original Child's Play? There is a rumour out there, which is evident from a quick Google search and multiple articles online, that claims that Chucky the Doll is based on a supposed haunted toy called Robert the Doll. The story of Robert the Doll began in Key West, Florida during 1904, when a little boy named Robert Eugene Otto, known as Gene, was given the doll as a birthday gift from his grandfather. The doll was made by the Steiff Company, was 3 feet tall, made of straw and human hair. Robert Eugene, or Gene as he was known, named the doll Robert after himself, and he took him everywhere with him. The boy formed a very strong attachment to the doll, to the extent that some people apparently described it as an unhealthy relationship. Basically, it was rare for Gene to ever be seen without Robert the doll. Gene was often heard having whispered conversations with Robert, which, if you know kids, is perfectly normal. But it was said that on some occasions, a deep voice, different to Gene's, was heard replying. And the strangeness didn't stop there. On multiple occasions, loud, violent outbursts were heard coming from Gene's bedroom, with furniture being found overturned and toys ripped apart. And on each of these occasions, Gene would claim that it wasn't him, but it was Robert doing it. Over the years, there were claims of the doll moving, changing its facial expression, and giggling. Even in adulthood, Gene remained attached to this doll. After his parents died, Gene moved back into his family home with his wife, Annette. Robert the doll was kept in a room upstairs and was sat at the window looking out onto the street. And there were multiple reports of people walking past the window and seeing Robert move, disappear, and then reappear. Even Gene's wife, Annette, was unnerved by the doll, and so, on his wife's request, Robert was locked in the attic. It was said, I don't know who by, but according to my research, it was said that Robert didn't like this, and footsteps could be heard running around in the attic. And in the end, Gene moved Robert the doll to the turret room, where Gene, who had grown up to become an artist, would spend his time painting, and Robert had a view of the street once again. There is another version of the origin of Robert the doll that claims that a woman of Bahamian descent had worked as a maid or a servant in the Otto household when Gene was younger, but had been mistreated like a lot of their serving staff apparently, and eventually fired after being caught practicing voodoo. But before she left, she apparently put a voodoo curse on Robert the doll and gave it as a gift to the young Gene as a way to get her revenge. Now look, it's not hard when you hear the story to see why people believe that the story of Robert the doll is the inspiration behind Chucky. I mean, it has voodoo, it has an evil doll, it has a young child being manipulated by it. There are quite a lot of similarities, but the truth is that there is no proof or documentation or quotes that prove that it ever was the inspiration. Neither Don Mancini, the writer of Child's Play and creator of Chucky, or Tom Holland, the director of Child's Play, have ever cited Robert the Doll as having anything to do with the inspiration behind the movie. In reality, the idea for Child's Play was actually first conceived when Mancini was studying as a film major at the University of California. Already a lifelong fan of the horror genre when writing the screenplay, Mancini said that he took inspiration from horror movies such as Poltergeist and A Nightmare on Elm Street, and from the Twilight Zone TV series, in particular one episode called Living Doll. The other inspiration behind Child's Play was the consumerism of the 1980s. Now, the 80s are remembered for a multitude of things, usually big hair, bright colours, shoulder pads, MTV, strikes, the AIDS crisis, and the rise of the yuppie. But the 80s are also considered a time when materialism and consumerism were at an all-time high. By the 1980s, mass production was in full swing thanks to the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. But the problem with mass production is that you can produce a large number of items at a very quick rate, and it doesn't take long before what's being produced outnumbers the actual demand from consumers and people who are spending their money. So what happens then? Well, that's when manufacturers begin to design and create their products and their items with planned, now I struggle with this word, obsolescence. Obsolescence. Basically making them obsolete or breakable, so that over time the item will fail and break, needing to be replaced, meaning people will spend more money. Manufacturers also massively rely on marketing to both target and manipulate the consumer. And Don Mancini's father actually worked as an advertising executive during the 1980s. And growing up, Mancini saw firsthand the effect that marketing had on children, and he wasn't a fan of it, especially of the advertising term consumer trainees, which is what they called children. In a 2013 interview, Mancini said, quote, "I just knew a lot about the world of advertising and how cynical it is, especially with regard to children," end quote. Tie into that cynicism the Cabbage Patch Kids doll that was all the rage in the 80s, where every parent felt like they were failing if they didn't get their kid that for Christmas, and you've got the ingredients for a very successful and smart slasher movie. Mancini has also stated that the range of My Buddy dolls that came out in the 80s played a big part in his vision for the final look of Chucky. So even though I knew that alterations were made to the script, I didn't realise that there was a completely different version to the story, where Mancini's original script focused much more heavily on the marketing side of it. In this version, Andy's mum Karen is working as an advertising executive for the Good Guy Company, is recently divorced from her husband, and due to her job is a mostly absent mother to Andy. And Chucky was originally going to be called Buddy. It had to be changed because of the My Buddy doll range that came out. And he wasn't a doll possessed by a serial killer, but rather an actual doll that had been made with synthetic blood and latex skin, which could be damaged. And the trouble would start when Andy cut his own thumb and mixed his blood with that of Buddy's, or Chucky's, in a blood-packed type thing, and that is what led to Buddy coming to life. Rather than a serial killer, Buddy was meant to represent Andy's rage and would kill people who could be considered an enemy of Andy, such as his teacher, his babysitter, and even his own mum Karen. And in the end, Buddy, who only comes alive while Andy is asleep, would decide to kill Andy himself, and that way Buddy could stay alive forever. Obviously, if you've seen the movie, you know this isn't the movie that we got. I mentioned earlier that due to the writer's strike in 1988, Mancini wasn't able to work on the movie any further, and the script was adapted and rewritten by Tom Holland, David Kirshner, and John Lafia. It was writer John Lafia who came up with the idea of Chucky being a doll who was possessed by a human, and initially he'd considered it being an electrocuted inmate in prison. Producer David Kirshner added to this idea by suggesting that it was a serial killer who possesses the doll after being killed in a toy store, and it was also Kirshner who came up with the name Charles Lee Ray. To make the name, he took parts of the names of three killers/serial killers who had been very prevalent in the news during his own childhood, which were Charles Manson, who, along with his family of followers, were responsible for the Sharon Tate murders and others, Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who killed President Kennedy, and James Earl Ray, the man who killed Martin Luther King. But it was actually John Lafayette who coined the nickname Chucky. And finally, director Tom Holland added the voodoo element to the story and the rule of Chucky needing to transfer his soul into the body of the first person he revealed his identity to. Holland, inspired by the serial killers of the 70s, the Hillside Stranglers, also added the character of Eddie as Charles Lee Ray's partner to kind of reflect the partnership of the Hillside Stranglers, because Charles Lee Ray is the Lakeshore Strangler. So this episode, while being a look at the real inspirations behind the creation of Child's Play and its villain Chucky, has also kind of been about debunking some of the false or at least misleading stories out there of what the movie is based on and inspired by. And I do think that the story of Robert the Doll is interesting. I mean, who doesn't love a good, creepy, haunted doll story? It's just that Robert the Doll was not the inspiration, according to the creators, behind Child's Play and Chucky. It is, however, the inspiration behind the series of movies, Robert the Doll. I think there's about 4 of them now. I've not actually ever seen any of them. But yeah, it's a good story, so of course a film has been made about it. Just not this one. I hope you guys enjoyed it and found it interesting. If you did, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. And let me know in the comments if there was anything here that you hadn't heard before. For me personally, I was really interested in learning about the original script. It's so interesting to think that that could have been the movie we would have ended up with if it just hadn't been for the writer's strike. Let me know in the comments actually if you would have preferred that one to the one that we got. That's an interesting thought. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye guys.